are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest is a British rapper, activist, and writer who is, among other things, very involved in the struggle for Palestinian rights. He is known as Lowkey, Lowkey. And if you haven't heard his music, I strongly recommend that you check it out, especially what may be his best known song, which is called Terrorist with a question mark. And he recently wrote an article I found very compelling for the website electronicintifada.net. We've had other writers from that website on, and Lowkey's article was headlined, "Why is an Israeli intelligence-linked company filtering U.S. journalists' emails?" So without any further introduction, Lowkey, welcome to the program.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And by the way, is there anything would you prefer that I address you by some other name than Lowkey?
However you like.
All right. Well, and by the way, Lowkey is, I know it's slang for keeping something secret or not well known. It's also, according to my extensive study of Norse mythology via Marvel Comics, the name of the Norse god of mischief or something. Did that factor into your choice of a name?
To be honest, I don't think I gave it that much thought, because at the time where I kind of absorbed the name as part of my daily life, I was only about 17 or 16. We used to rap in school, and I needed a name to go by when I went to the open mics. And the first time I went there, they asked me my name, and I just thought, okay, Lowkey. Just so happened there was another rapper there by the name of Lowkey, and so we battled for the name. And because I won the name from then on, it just stuck, and it's been, a vehicle through which I've been able to speak to many people around the world. So I don't really see any reason to let go of it now, I think.
And it was clearly meant to be. So, and speaking of things that are low-key or kept secret from the public, tell us about this intelligence-linked company and its relationship to U.S. journalists' emails.
Well, I think firstly, we have to take into account Israel's wider war against journalism. That's represented by the arrest of Palestinian journalists for incitement for things they post on Facebook. There's about 15 Palestinian journalists in prison, in Israeli prisons now, for that accusation of incitement. It also even extends to children and poets like Darin Tator. She was imprisoned by Israel for incitement for a poem she put on Facebook. And it goes further than that, actually, as we've obviously seen in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera correspondent. But you also have organizations like BICOM, an organization that is the largest Israel lobby group in Britain, which works specifically on pressuring people within the media to have a more pro-Israel slant to the way that they report the news. And it's very, very well funded, very well put together. Pojo Zabludovic is the gentleman behind it, who gained his wealth from his father's Soltam Systems, which is an arms company, which was later subsumed by Elbit Systems, which is the largest Israeli arms company. It has a lot of support within both the political and the media class. Unfortunately, it's largely unknown by the British public, but yet we constantly complain about the pro-Israel slant of mainstream media. So when we talk about Proofpoint, which is the cybersecurity company, which it was revealed filters the emails of both CNN and Washington Post, we have to understand it as a wider issue of Israel attempting to influence journalism. You also have the case of the Pegasus spyware NSO group, and we know that it's claimed by NSO group that they do not have access to the information that their Pegasus spyware has been used to extract from people's phones. So when, for instance, they sell it to Saudi Arabia or to the UAE, They supposedly don't have access to that information. However, somebody on their advisory board on ethics, Sherry Blair, human rights lawyer and wife of known war criminal Tony Blair, she actually was able to pass on information to the ex-wife of the ruler of Dubai because of information that had been procured by the ruler of Dubai using NSO Pegasus spyware. So clearly there's a wider push to surveil, interfere with, and actually suppress, unfortunately, actual journalism. Now,
and not just, if I may interrupt for a moment, Lowkey, not just journalists, but you mentioned poets. That includes yourself, I believe, as a musician. I believe there was an attempt recently to get your music removed from Spotify, right?
Yes, and that was by a branch of BICOM, which goes by the name of We Believe in Israel. Now, We Believe in Israel was launched by somebody who actually describes himself as a political consultant to defense companies about their sales to the MOD. He was previously a consultant for Finmeccanica, which is an Italian defense contractor that has a $1 billion deal to supply training jets to Israel's Air Force. He you know, the relationship between this gentleman, Luke Akehurst, and the political class is extremely troubling because he's also on the NEC within the Labour Party. So he has a key decision-making role really within the Labour Party infrastructure. And his project, We Believe in Israel, which is in the same office as BICOM, which is a project and funded by BICOM, it also acknowledges that it has a coordination with quote-unquote key stakeholders, including the Israeli embassy. So yes, it launched a project to get my music taken down from Spotify with the allegation that it was tantamount to incitement against Jewish people and Israelis. So the very same allegation which is put against many different journalists within Palestine, but of course I'm not within Israeli jurisdiction, so you can't arrest me for the music that I have made and that has actually been heard by millions of people. Just to sort of take it back though to this question of proof point, because, you know, as you say, I mean, though, by the way, it's important to know that that campaign against me has not just been limited to trying to take my music off Spotify. It has led to the cancelling of at least 5 or 6 of my events over the last 2 months. That has taken the form of lobbying of trade unions. It's taken the form of lobbying of festivals. I think they realized with the Spotify campaign that they had more interest in maintaining quite a low profile campaign with this lobbying, because it would make it a lot harder for us to fight it out in the open. So that has gone on, and obviously it has cost me fairly dearly, but at the same time, I do not think that they are as powerful as they think they are. And I think the realm of culture, you know, they've been able to, in a way, an extension of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is the political cleansing of particularly English-speaking countries' political systems. And what happened is they, during the Corbyn years, successfully had the infrastructure fortified through which they could cleanse the Labour Party. And now it's extending into Labour councillors who are like in municipalities. So they're far less powerful than parliamentary members. But also now it's about the trade unions, and now it's about the organisations linked to the trade unions and the kind of acceptable left. So it's
and Lowkey, for those of our listeners who might not know, although we've covered it on the show, the cleansing, as you put it, of the Labour Party in Britain was quite, it had a very Stalinist vibe to it, at least to me, in the sense that, I mean, really people who made harmless comments were demonized. and Corbyn himself was very unjustly treated, extremely decent man, but on the program. So you had that aspect of it. And there's an echo of it here in the United States with now the millions of dollars being poured into Democratic parties against members of Congress and others, for example, who are strong, certainly for in U.S. terms, strong voices for Palestinian rights. We're seeing that being fought out here now. And we've had a long history of, until very recently, it was very difficult to talk about Palestinian rights in the U.S. media at all. So I think I think you're right to contextualize this in the broader sense of not of differences of opinion, even about the rights of Palestinians, but about the attempt to absolutely suppress certain opinions.
Yeah, and I mean, it's granular and it's attritional. So yes, it entails the searching in a forensic manner through people's social media posts, then using those social media posts to sort of monsterize the person, decontextualizing the comments and pumping them out through a servile media within this country, which in and of itself, you look at the Daily Mail, for example, the one of, if not the most read daily papers here, the city editor for the Daily Mail is a gentleman by the name of Alex Brummer. Now, Alex Brummer is the chair of something called the Abraham Initiatives, simultaneous to being the city editor of the Daily Mail. Now, the Abraham Initiatives is funded not only by the Israeli Ministry of Justice, but also by the Israeli Ministry of Labor. In addition to that, he has a key role, high-ranking role at the Board of Deputies. Now, the Board of Deputies was a key organization in the war against Corbyn, and following the neutralization of the Corbyn threat, the Board of Deputies put in its trustees report that it has, quote unquote, and this is a direct quote, a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthened ties with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the IDF. Now, this wasn't commented upon. I was the first person that discovered this. It seems that an organization that had such a key role in killing Corbynism, nobody was looking through their trustees' reports, and then nobody was problematizing this link to a foreign power that has had a real history of espionage within Britain and in other places. But I don't want to digress too much because, the core of what you've asked me is about this company, Proofpoint. Now, of course, we know that Donald Trump sought to obtain the details of Washington Post journalists through Proofpoint. This was revealed in court documents. And this is the way that first came to my attention that Proofpoint were doing Washington Post's emails, were filtering them. But what we also were able to find out is that Proofpoint were also filtering the emails of CNN. Now, what it means to filter their emails is that you are protecting those emails from malware. But it means that that data is, of course, visible to these very companies, these cybersecurity companies. Now, the point at which this becomes perhaps a little bit worthy of suspicion is that over the past 6 years, during which it has been filtering the emails for these key media organizations, Proofpoint has subsumed several companies which were set up by alumni of the Israeli military and intelligence institutions, including one company that attended a special invitation-only meeting which was funded by several Israeli government ministries, including the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence. Now, could we imagine the equivalent happening if Proofpoint had subsumed 3 companies set up by alumni of Russian military and intelligence institutions? Would that not be questioned? And of course, there's a personal aspect to this because Proofpoint has evidently also provided email filtering services to major British universities like SOAS, where I got my master's, like UCL, and like the University of Surrey. Now, this company, Proofpoint, is a US company, but it currently has 200 employees across 4 floors in the Azrieli Center in Tel Aviv, directly next door to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And actually, that complex, that building, is attached by a bridge, by a pedestrian bridge, to the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence. Now, if we were to look at the first company worthy of scrutiny, which was subsumed by Proofpoint, the company which filters CNN and Washington Post's emails, it would be the company FireLayers. Now, FireLayers, according to reports, was fully funded by YL Ventures. Now, YL Ventures is an Israeli seed stage angel funding investor that specifically targets organizations which are set up by former or current Israeli military personnel. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, YL Ventures actually receives alerts, and this is direct verbatim quote from the Wall Street Journal, based on the background of potential founders. Indicators of interest include whether they are in the IDF. Now, according to Ben Bernstein of Twistlock, YL Ventures has a terrific reputation among ex-IDF cybersecurity veterans. And the individual behind YL Ventures is Yoav Andrew Ledersdorf, who actually is on schedule to speak at the 2023 Cybertech Global Conference in Tel Aviv, alongside both the President and Prime Minister of Israel. Previously, this gentleman has spoken at similar events alongside former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's also, in addition to that, been hosted by the IDF's tech unit to talk about his work with YL Ventures. Now, the actual founders of FireLayers, who, remember, their whole project has been funded by YL Ventures, are Yair Grindlinger and Doron Ograssi. Now, both of these gentlemen were described by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz as veterans of the IDF's computer unit. Now, if you were to ask Yair Grindlinger how his work in the IDF affects his work with FireLayers, this is his exact words. He said, "It's been a while since then, and I'm still in the game." Well, what does still in the game exactly mean? So the year before Proofpoint subsumed FireLayers into it, Grindlinger actually represented the company at the US-Israel Cyberspace and Intelligence Conference at the Institute for National Security Studies in Washington, D.C. Now, the INSS is extremely close to Israeli intelligence. It's led by the former head of Israeli intelligence. Now, according to the program for that conference, it was a synergetic hub that initiated cooperation between Israeli, US, and worldwide entities. According to the program, you had an Israeli delegation of 70 participants from various government offices. The keynote speakers at the conference were, in fact, the former head of Grindlinger's unit in the Israeli military and also the former head of Israeli military intelligence. The program for the conference states very clearly the Israeli government is supporting this event by sponsoring Israeli companies to come and present. And it also lists among its supporters Israel's foreign, intelligence, and economic ministry, as well as its cybertech unit in the IDF. It's so close that Grindling is even quoted on the conference expressing his gratitude for the invitation. There's several other companies too, which I'm happy to go into in a minute, that Proofpoint absorbed. And when I say absorbed, I don't mean they acquired them and they're still run as separate companies. I mean, the employees of those companies that they subsumed now are explicitly employed by Proofpoint, meaning you have former IDF intelligence filtering CNN and Washington Post emails.
Exactly. And it seems to me, Lowkey, that Yair Grindlinger is an interesting figure in all of this because, as your article points out, he describes himself as a former officer in the Israeli military's computer and technology unit, the Mamram unit, that's still in the game. That phrase, still in the game, at least in this country, when people who are affiliated with in any way with the intelligence community talk about being still in the game, they're talking about the intelligence game. I would assume the same would apply there, but although of course I don't know. But what you have, it seems to me, and what you're describing is a confluence of relationships that suggest intimate interconnections between the organizations filtering and possessing the emails of these key journalists and intelligence agencies, particularly U.S. and then to a lesser extent, perhaps the United States. I mean, particularly Israeli, and then perhaps to a lesser extent the United States as well. And it makes me wonder why you've done great digging here, and I admire it. It makes me wonder why nobody has asked this question. Two things: why these questions haven't come up before, and perhaps even more importantly, how they managed to get these contracts with these two extremely sensitive publications, the Washington Post and CNN.
Absolutely. One would wonder. I mean, the key thing is that there has been a major push by the state of Israel to feed former Unit 8200 military intelligence employees into major tech companies. So we have to understand that Unit 8200 is the part of the Israeli military which monitors the electronic communications of Palestinians. You've had whistleblowers within Unit 8200 come out and say this information is being used to blackmail Palestinians. It's being used to work out how likely they are to become collaborators. It's a real surveillance matrix that is built up through the Unit 8200 system. And what you have is organizations like Startup Nation Central, which is Paul Singer, key Republican donor, Paul Singer Project, along with Dan Cena, based off the back of Dan Cena's book, Startup Nation Central, on a way to combat BDS. And the organization explicitly says its aim is to combat BDS by not only moving big tech jobs into Israel, but also moving former Israeli Unit 8200 people into major tech companies. So there's been research which has found tens of former Unit 8200 employees in Google, similar figures in Facebook. We, of course, know that Amy Palmer, who previously set up the cyber unit in 2015 for the Israeli Ministry of Justice. She was Director General of the Ministry of Justice, which the cyber unit specifically works on shutting down email accounts that has a problem with and building links with Facebook. We, of course, know that Facebook supposedly responds positively and acquiesces to Israeli requests for 85% of the requests that the Israeli government make for shutting down of accounts. Amy Palmer now is on the oversight board for Facebook. So she literally went from establishing a unit which their aim was to lobby Facebook to delete Palestinian accounts to now being on the oversight board of Facebook, which only has 20 people on it. So it's not a huge amount of people. We don't really think there's any other opposing views given to her on that board. She also was a key figure in the Israeli Land Council, which is key ethnic cleansing body within Palestine, settlement building, I should say, body within Palestine. So, it's a wider policy of entryism. And, it's not just the case of the Paul Singer organization. You also have organizations like Cyber Threat Intelligence League, which was set up by Ohad Zaidenberg, former agent in Unit 8200, who also now still works for an organization funded by the Israeli government, set up this cybersecurity company with the purpose of providing pro bono cybersecurity for nuclear reactors, chemical plants, and hospitals in the United States during the COVID pandemic. Now, all I'm arguing for is actually equal treatment, because if Ohad Zaidenberg was a former Russian military intelligence figure and simultaneously worked for an organization funded by the Russian government, you would certainly not find him in the role of providing pro bono cybersecurity for key sensitive positions within the United States. You look at an organization like Leidos or Lockheed Martin, the key military company within the United States. Its cybersecurity is provided by Cybereason, which was set up by 5 former Unit 8200 agents. So all of these are massive conflicts of interest, actually, and in any functioning political system would be worthy of scrutiny. Unfortunately, when it comes to the state of Israel, it really doesn't seem we actually have those now in the United States.
Well, no, absolutely not. And we have extensive discussions in this country about foreign interference in U.S. elections, but Israel rarely gets mentioned, even though in those conversations, even though the evidence is large, huge for and widely available for its involvement. Lowkey, there are 2 issues I hope we can touch on it before we finish. One is this, people might say, even despite this very deep web that you've described, well, what does this really prove? And I would encourage people to perhaps, among other things, draw a connection with the Black Cube story. Black Cube being a private a detective agency, security firm made up of, and advertising itself as made up of former Israeli intelligence officers. It worked for Harvey Weinstein, the film producer, trying to discredit the Me Too women coming forward with his abuses. They worked for, aides to Donald Trump, contracted with Black Cube to undermine the nuclear deal with Iran that Obama had negotiated with Iran. So it seems to me there's a pretty extensive record of seeding, SEED, seeding people, from this Israeli intelligence network into various aspects of American and British life and life elsewhere. And and B, there's also a record of, although it doesn't get discussed much, of Israel and people associated with Israel acting directly against American interests, whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to Republicans in Congress to rebuke a Democratic president, whether it's the sinking of a ship, whether it's a Jonathan Pollard spy case. So I think to those people listening who might say, well, but they're friends or something, that we're not talking about friends here. We're talking about an intelligence community that, whether American or Israeli, tends to serve its own interests and its own goals. Do you think I'm reading too much into it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, if they were to take the issue of Proofpoint to task, I would say also that Proofpoint has subsumed 2 other organizations with a revolving door relationship with the Israeli military intelligence. You have Observe It, which, had an employee go from working for Observe It to then later on working for Israeli intelligence as well. So then one would have to wonder, if Observe It was involved in the filtering of CNN and Washington Post's emails, and then an employee of that company then goes on to work for Israeli intelligence, what could be the ramifications of something like that? In addition to that, you've got a senior HR employee at Proofpoint, previously worked for 6 years in an undisclosed job at the Israeli Prime Minister's office. The vice president of the cloud security at Proofpoint is formerly a section commander in the Unit 8200 part of the Israeli military. The senior director of security research is Roe Cohen-Dweck, who served in the Israeli military intelligence corps. So really, when you think about the kind of journalism that CNN and Washington Post and the Washington Post purport to carry out, then surely any foreign military intelligence being anywhere near their emails would be a problem. And so I would say to those people, well, you actually claim that the ideals of our society are democracy and freedom of the press. If you believe that your society contains freedom of the press, then on pure principle, you should be opposed to this. Not because those relationships bear fruit, but because if they do bear fruit, then it would be a danger to these ideals which you supposedly hold sacred and dear to your heart, and in fact believe are defining of our civilization.
Well, I think that's very well said. And I would also say, just in closing, at least for myself, that I've actually known some retired senior intelligence people from the United States. I wouldn't trust them with our journalist letters either. And one thing they said to me was, you never truly retire from the intelligence community. And I assume the same is true certainly in Israel as well. And this is something that should concern everybody, and people should be seeking transparency on. Your work on this has been excellent. If you have a closing comment, I'd be delighted to hear it.
Pardon me, I would just say thank you very much, Richard, for giving me a platform. I really appreciate it. As you well know, the space is getting smaller and smaller for dissenting voices to speak out. So it's great to have this opportunity to speak to you. Thanks very much.
Well, it's a pleasure, and you're welcome anytime. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.